Hey everyone, it's Simi Shaw, and welcome to Trailblazers. On this podcast, I dive deep into the journeys of trailblazing South Asians, sharing the stories of the leaders and dreamers lighting the way across the South Asian diaspora. Hello, Trailblazers. Today, our guest is none other than Arjun Pulijal, president of Capitol Music Group. Capitol Music Group is an American frontline umbrella label owned by the Universal Music Group. In this role, he oversees all areas of artist development, including creative, marketing, and operations. Based in LA, Arjun joined the company in 2013 as the director of marketing. In 2016, he ascended to the role of vice president and later was promoted to the role of senior vice president, head of marketing in 2020. Prior to Arjun's work at Capitol Music Group, he spent 7 years in New York at Epic Records, a subsidiary of Sony Music Entertainment. There, he served as director of marketing and artist development, manager of digital marketing, and he started his career there in A&R, aka artists and repertoire. Throughout his career in the music industry, Arjun's roster of artists to date spans Shakira, Paul McCartney, Elton John, Halsey, Troye Sivan, Lewis Capaldi, Sam Smith, ABBA, Norah Jones, and many, many more, clearly because I'm out of breath. He graduated with a bachelor's in music and computer science from NYU in 2006 and has since clearly made an incredible mark on the music industry. Arjun, I'm so excited to chat with you today about all things music and your journey through this industry. Welcome to Trailblazers.
Thank you. And I've actually spent a lot of time listening to past episodes of this. And I think it's just when I came into this position, it was really important to me to do things like this, to connect with the South Asian community, the Asian community in general, because, and I'm sure we'll get into it more, but like when I first started in this industry, there was no roadmap. So to be able to be a little bit more vocal about it now, and hopefully that whether it's younger people or people trying to get into the industry get to see it, it's like an inspiring idea to me. So thank you for doing this.
Oh, well, that's very kind of you to say. And to your point, a lot of South Asians who are industry leaders like yourself didn't have role models to look up to or people's stories to share in, which speaks to the mission of Trailblazers. So I want to go ahead and jump into your story and talk a little bit about what jump-started your interest in the music industry.
My family's very musical. My mother was really into Bharatanatyam growing up and learned dance actually at a little bit of an older age. Like it was when I was probably in like kindergarten, she started learning. And my father played sitar growing up, and they grew up in Hyderabad, so southern India. And they were really into South Indian classical music, Carnatic music. And that was part of my life from like a really early age. So I learned South Indian classical singing, and I was just sort of around it. And then when I got to be a little bit older, like elementary school age, I started playing sitar and tabla. And my sister was actually singing Hindustani classical music at that point. So it was like very much like an Indian music culture in my family. And I also have a lot of people who are first generation. I have a massive extended family with lots of first cousins, a lot of whom lived in India. And I used to go to India like every summer growing up, and a lot of exposure to Bollywood and Bollywood culture as well. So that was really my first interaction with music. And I didn't really listen to a lot of Western music until probably I was like in 6th, 7th, 8th grade, like around that time. I think for me, it was like, you know, when you have first generation parents, you kind of feel like an alien in Western culture. And you're like, what is my connection to this? I feel like I'm living in a simulation and I'm supposed to be learning things as I'm going culturally. And honestly, music was the way that I was able to connect to things, and things made sense for me. And so when I started to really get into Western music, it was a way to like make friends and a way to talk to people that, you know, I probably normally wouldn't have a lot in common with. And I developed a lot of friendships with people on the basis of music across ethnicities and cultures and religions. And that was exciting to me. And then connected to that, I really got into playing guitar. I remember I would go to India in the summer. I remember like the summer of 8th or 9th grade. I went to India and I was at my grandmother's house, and I just had this like old disgusting acoustic guitar that was like, there's all these like knockoff brands in India. It's like, you buy it and it's supposed to be Gibson, but it's like Gibson. And I would buy these guitars and I would just like sit in there and play guitar like all summer. And anyway, I started playing in bands and that just became a thing for me as I got into high school, and I was sort of like really into sports and really into music. And I was like, which one am I going to choose? I ended up choosing music. And then it came time to go to college. And I, of course, was like, Mom, Dad, I'm going to be in a band. I'm not going to go to college. It's not, I don't need that. And they were like, that's cool. That's not going to happen. And my parents are very supportive, super open-minded. But even for them, it was like, they're both software engineers and came into this country to get masters and things like that. And that was not an option, not going to school. So the way I then sort of got into college was my compromise was like, okay, I'll go to music school. So I went to NYU and did music technology. And all this time, I never thought about working at a record label or being on the business side of music. It was a foreign concept to me. All of my ambition was in music performance, music production. I was even doing summer courses about film scoring and recording classical music. Like I was just, anything that had to do with the creation of music, I was all about it. And I made a friend when I was in college and we were in a band together. And we got close to graduating and he was a college rep for Sony. And Sony basically had programs at all these different colleges, NYU being one of them, where they had college students that would sort of help promote artists. And he was very into that and he got a job at Epic Records. And he started at Epic Records and I was working at a studio right out of college, like as a studio engineer, and was just helping artists record, and I was playing in bands, things like that. And he came to me one day and he was like, do you want to do A&R? Because there's an A&R opening at Epic. And I literally said to him, what's A&R? I don't even know what that is. And he was like, well, you can scout talent, you can meet other songwriters, you can meet other producers. It's a good way to sort of network yourself. And so I just was like, okay, yeah, I'll go interview for it. Better than staying up until 4 a.m. every day at a music studio. And that was my start in the record industry. That was about 15, 16 years ago now.
And so when you get scouted for this role in A&R at Sony, is there any part of you that's still hanging on to this idea of, but wait, I want to be a musician?
Absolutely. That's actually a common occurrence for me where I would be sort of conflicted about whatever path I was taking, because you have sort of a residual self-image of how you see yourself. And then the world is opening doors for you in different ways. And you have to sort of decide, like, is the archetype of who I thought I was what I want to be strict about? Or do I take the opportunity in front of me? And, to this day, I mean, I'm sitting in my basement, which is a studio with lots of guitars and instruments and stuff. For a long time, I was playing in bands and recording music and writing music and all that stuff while I was working at record labels. And I think it got to a point where it's like it became fun for me, because I was like, hey, my career ambition is not tied up into what I want to do creatively as an artist, I should say, or as a musician. It's like I can do this for fun and I can still have a really fulfilling experience doing that. But what I love about working at a record label, as I've learned it over the years, is that you get to be at the sort of crossroads of so many different kinds of artists, so many things going on culturally. You get exposure to so many different subcultures that you would never get as just being confined to the perspective of just your own thing. And so that's something that really inspires me over the long term that I don't think I really anticipated going into it.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. It's interesting, and I appreciate you expressing that sentiment, because a lot of the conversations I have with people on Trailblazers is around this idea of we have these passions and deciding which ones we should turn into careers, which ones we should continue pursuing, as something creatively. And to your point, it sounds like you found this beautiful balance between the two.
Yeah, I think the difficult part about navigating what you just were referencing is that, especially when you're younger, and especially if you're a minority, because there's not an archetype that you're following, it's like you don't know what you don't know. You can somehow feel like, oh, there's a path I have to follow. And then when you're exposed to something new, you're like, wait, I never thought about it that way. And my own ego was getting in my way or something like that. When I was at Epic Records, I did A&R for the first couple of years there. And it wasn't a really fulfilling experience for me being an A&R person at that label at that time. The industry was really in transition, and I found that like my musical taste was at odds with the priorities at the label. Working at major labels, it's a very volatile industry, and whenever there's regime change at the top of a major label, there's usually a lot of staff turnover. And I basically was given a choice a couple of years into it of, hey, we're re-engineering our entire A&R staff. Either you have a job here in marketing or you don't have a job here.
Oh my gosh.
At first I was like, I'm not going to do marketing. I'm an A&R person. I'm a music person. That's what I've done. And I remember I had a conversation with the outgoing head of A&R at the time. And I let him know about this like opportunity I'd been floated. And he looked at me sideways and he goes, absolutely take the marketing job. He's like, you're going to learn so much more about the music industry and it's going to ultimately make you a better A&R person down the road. And I did it reluctantly at the time. But then what I found out over time is that I actually have done more A&R in the way that I've wanted to do A&R as a marketing person than I ever did as an A&R person. It's just something that you wouldn't anticipate. And then you go and you live it and you realize, wait, there's so much more depth and nuance to this situation than I thought.
Absolutely. To that end, I'm curious, what are some of the challenges you faced in the early innings of your career being in such a competitive industry that, as you said, is pretty volatile, changes a lot, particularly being someone who's a minority and not someone who had a lot of people to look up to in this field?
I think the challenges at that part of my career are like, it kind of mimics a lot of the challenges when you're a minority growing up in a culture that feels alien to you. When you work in a corporate environment, and especially like an entertainment corporate environment, there's a sort of culture about the place. There's a networking about the place. There's nepotism in these places, which is a natural part of society. And the one thing I'll say is there is that immigrant mentality of all I have is whatever meritocracy exists. And I have to be the best in class and the model employee or whatever to prove my worth. And I think that that's a really like mentally exhausting thing to put on yourself.
Yeah.
So I think it was sort of like learning like what are the norms here? And that's probably not exclusive to being a minority. I think anytime you're probably a younger person learning corporate culture, there's a little bit of that. Not really understanding economically what the track is, because you're taught to be very, or I shouldn't say you, I was taught to be very ambitious and money-minded and smart about being risk averse and having financial security. These are all things that my parents had to use to build a life for themselves here. And when you're working with people who have generational wealth, when you're working with people who are connected, they're not living a paycheck to paycheck. And they have the luxury of that sort of longer arc of like, the universe will look out for me. It's all good. You know, that kind of thing. You don't really have that ability when there's no safety net. And you're just like, I have to embrace whatever challenge is in front of me and I have to win every game. So I think a lot of like normalizing to culture and like learning, that piece of it was challenging in the early stages of my career. Having some sense of perspective of like, where are you in your story? You sort of feel like every decision you're making has like all this weight and all this importance to it. And then as time passes, you're like, well, actually, you know, now that I have some perspective, I can see that, you know, I was micro-focusing on X, Y, or Z, right?
Yeah.
And then there was the industry part of it where I joined a major label, you know, we're talking 2006, 2007. And that was pre-streaming. That's the transition of physical to digital media. It was a really volatile time in the industry because the industry was built on executives, artists, and a pay structure. And corporations are big entities that have to worry about a lot of things and they can't change very fast. Change comes slower for corporations, major corporations. It was a business in complete transition. And I felt like I was sort of trying to surf like really choppy waters or something. And in retrospect now, that was an opportunity for me because the structures at the corporation were breaking down. And I was actually able to navigate that to learn different aspects of the industry. So I'm at Epic, regime change. I go from A&R to marketing. 3 more regime changes while I'm at the company. And I was able to be marketing, then digital marketing, then publicity, then come back to being somebody running projects. So got to learn a lot of like different aspects of the industry that if it was a status quo structure, probably wouldn't have been able to be like flexible and learn different things and different perspectives. So I think the chaos of disruption and being able to kind of unknowingly embrace it, I guess, and persevere through it, I think was probably another hallmark of like that period.
Yeah. All that you touched on from the immigrant mentality perspective is super, super relatable. You know, I'm also first generation. My parents immigrated here. The whole being money-minded, looking for financial stability, but simultaneously want to pursue these paths where you don't necessarily know how it's all going to pan out at the end. Super, super relatable and interesting. You ended up spending 7 years at Epic. Can you speak to any memorable experiences and lessons learned while there? And at what point you felt like, hey, this is what I'm going to pursue long term?
There was definitely a ton of experience accrued because I worked with a lot of different leaders and a lot of different personalities. And I didn't know that I was sort of training for phase 2 of my career at the time, but it was just like learning a lot of what not to do, frankly, because I saw people come and go, people who got elevated because of short-term success or were over-promoted or things like that. And when you're younger and you're a little bit more ego-driven, you're like, wow, well, why is this getting promoted? Why I could do this, I could do that, whatever. And then you realize that their success is fleeting and that what you need to do is build an ecosystem for long-term sustainable success. I think the defining moment for me at Epic was, I think it was around 2009 or 2010, and I was promoted to a marketing manager. So that means for the first time, I'm running projects. I am the main point of contact for an artist, and I am the quarterback for everything that's happening. I had managed different aspects of campaigns, be it digital marketing or publicity or A&R. And when I was in A&R, I was like on the administrative level and sort of junior. So I wasn't really like running things myself. So this was the first time in my career that I was able to do that. And I was given a roster of artists and, I'm forging relationships with these artists and their managers and their camps and trying to figure out, what do I prioritize? What's important? And this is also in the context of a shifting industry, right? Because the physical business is dying. You're trying to figure out, okay, iTunes, all these things, which by the way, now are antiquated. But at the time it was the frontier. Wow. And I remember I wasn't great at it at first. And when you get into a new position, especially one of authority, and this is something I think anybody can apply to any stage of their career. I certainly can apply it to my career now. You have to learn the ins and outs of whatever that next level is that you're doing. I think that there's an illusion that people have that when you get promoted, that it's almost like, hey, I'm doing the same job that I do now, but I'm getting paid more with a fancier title to do it. They don't realize, and I didn't realize this, that it comes with sacrifices. Every time you level up in a corporate environment, you have less of a luxury of focusing on things that are just purely from a passion place or things that are purely from a relationship place. You have a responsibility that comes with that. And it's oftentimes you have to be diplomatic before you can be ideas driven, things like that, which it's tough to see. Again, you don't know what you don't know. So it's like until you're in the position of it, you can't quite get it. And I remember when I first came into being a product manager or marketing manager, I was doing the job in the way of like, I need to figure out what I'm supposed to do and make sure that I'm like coloring in the lines. And I wasn't really good at it at first because I didn't feel initiative. I didn't feel ownership. I felt like I was ceding to other people all the time. And then I remember there was a moment where I got to run a couple simultaneous campaigns for a bunch of artists, some who were really important on the label, like Incubus and Shakira and whatever it was at the time. And then some that were like developing artists that were like brand new artists that we signed. And I remember I had this like realization because we had just gone through another round of like layoffs or regime change or whatever. And there weren't a lot of resources to go around where I was like, you know what? I need to put blinders on and I need to do what I think is right. And I need to follow my instincts and be sort of stubborn about it. And so I kind of took on this, maybe not healthy for my personal life or work-life balance, but I was like, I'm going to own every aspect of these campaigns and I'm going to be authoritative when it comes to this. And were all the campaigns successful? No. But going through that process, you're like, wait, I can do this. I can be the architect of something that succeeds. I can be cavalier about things. I can go out on a limb and make decisions and not be afraid of failure. And I did have leadership, maybe not the most senior levels of the company, but I had leadership that was like supportive of that and people who helped foster me and teach me the business and things like that. So I think it was really like confidence building was maybe the main thing. And then the second thing at Epic is my last year there, I was pretty fatigued with the company because of all of the regime change. And I was living in New York at the time, and that was the headquarters of the company. And I was like, you know what? I want to move to LA because my friends were moving to LA. This was coming out of the financial crisis. So all the rents were like skyrocketing in New York. And it just felt like the economics of the music industry, like it wasn't sustainable in New York. There wasn't like creative communities there. You couldn't like, a band couldn't get rehearsal space. You know, it was like that kind of thing.
Fascinating. Yeah.
So I was like, you know what? And I was one of those people that I'm like, I'm a New Yorker for life. I'm never going to live anywhere else, that kind of thing. And I just impulsively decided I'm moving to LA. And the subtext of that for Sony at the time was like, LA was the satellite office. And if you wanted to get out of the company eventually, you moved to the satellite office. And so it was my way of sort of like getting off the radar. So I move out to LA, and then like within 2 weeks, they're like, so there's going to be a new guy running the company. His name's L.A. Reid, and he's going to be based in LA. And L.A. Reid was like a judge on the show The X Factor.
Sure.
They basically changed my job within like weeks once I moved out there. And it was basically like, we're going to be the de facto home for the X Factor artists that audition for the show. And we need somebody that has music and marketing acumen to be the judge for the shows. So like when you watch those shows, when they're like in North Carolina or Kansas City or whatever, and you see the like drone shots with the thousands of people outside waiting, right? Simon Cowell and those people, they're not seeing all of those people. There's people who screen them. And then like we're reporting up, oh, this person is really good, you should consider them. Or this person is probably not great, but they would make good TV, so you should consider them. So for about a year, that was the crux of my job. I was flying to all these different cities and I was a judge on these things. And in some ways it was soul crushing because you're face to face with a lot of talented people. You'll go there for a weekend and you'll see hundreds of people who are like, I've been singing my whole life. I've been doing it in the church, whatever. And like, I was born to do this. And they'll be really talented singer, but there's no other element to it that like, you think, oh, there's going to be an audience for this. And so you have to make these sort of decisions of like, what has potential, what doesn't. And I'm only quoting this experience because I think it was actually like a great learning experience for me. It's this like sort of real-time thing where you have to make value judgments, cutthroat value judgments, and live with the consequences of your decisions. And that to me was, I think, probably the first time in my career where I was really put in that position. And I think from that point on, I think it added another dimension to my skill set. Again, going back to the earlier part of our conversation where it's like, this is not something that I was excited to do at first. And it was not something that I was necessarily like running through the door, but you learn from it. And it actually, I think, added a lot of dimension to what I ended up doing next.
Super interesting. I want to speak about what happens next, which is you moving over to Capitol Music Group. But before that, to your point, it's clear that there's a lot of talent out there. And sometimes what separates people is right place, right time, or they have this some it factor or something that separates them from the crowd. And it's clear that there's a hunger for this in the mainstream market. How have you been able to parse through that? How do you decide who's the next Paul McCartney, who is the next Shakira?
Well, there's a lot that goes into that, and especially that's like unique to the way the world works now. We don't live in a world where you can anoint talent and then just fake it till you make it anymore.
Yeah.
An artist to make their way up in their career now has to like organically galvanize a core fan base. In the world of social media, in the world of short form content, of TikTok, all these things, that old school model of, hey, we're going to build this thing and we're going to just like have all of the gatekeepers at different, whether it's a Spotify or an Apple or a TV booker or whatever. You can't construct that and calculate it in the same way that you used to.
Yeah.
A lot of it is reading and reacting to what the audience is telling you right now, which is, as a record executive, when you build your career, it's a very destabilizing thing to have to understand that, like, we aren't the sole architects of this anymore. We're not the sole authority on this anymore. But what I would say is there's certain tenets that hold true in artist development, regardless of the era. I think it boils down to a couple of things. I think one is a balance of vision and confidence, but also balanced with the ability to take input and feedback from trusted people. Artists that can find that balance, I find, are more likely to succeed, because it means you're so confident in your vision that you can hear voices, trusted voices telling you about, hey, maybe focus on this one thing more than this other thing, or wait to release that song, or whatever that feedback is. I'm being hypothetical right now.
Sure.
But being able to find that balance of being open, but also being confident. Because I've seen the other side of it too, where if an artist doesn't have a backbone and they just keep listening to everyone around them versus their own instinct, that gets watered down very fast. I love nothing more than when an artist fights with me because they're passionate about something. That's what you want, right? Things that are tried and true, talent, the ability to perform, the ability to wow an audience with an instrument and your voice, without needing all the technology around you to kind of help you fake it. I understand that can be compelling, and I'm not dismissive of it, but I think just being able to perform and have people leave a show and say that artist is an incredible performer, it's not as prevalent as it used to be. And I do think that can give artists longevity. I would just say that the thing that's most important right now that differentiates previous eras of this industry when it comes to artistry is the ability to have a dialogue with your audience. I say that in a very general sense, but I was having an interesting conversation with an artist and somebody I work with the other day, and we were talking about how different artists in different genres talk to their audience and why hip hop has been so successful in this iteration of the industry. One of the main reasons, I think, is going back, hip hop, there's never been a big divide between the audience and the artist. The artist is always living their art to the audience and being very inclusive and very communicative with their audience. Whereas other forms of music like pop or rock or whatever, it's a very constructed thing, and there's kind of a divide between the artist and the audience.
Interesting.
And hip hop's been ahead of the curve when it comes to social media because it was always operating that way. And I think now other genres are understanding that oh, wait, we need to learn from this and we need to operate in a different way. And so, I think those are just some of the elements about, okay, what is essential, but it can take many different forms.
Super, super interesting. There's so many more questions I have here, but I want to spend some time on your journey to the Capitol Music Group, especially because that's where you serve as president today. Can you talk about the transition from Epic to Capitol and then your rise through the corporate ladder at this label?
Yeah. So after judging that show for a while, I was like, you know what? I'm done with this. I need to take a break. So I left that job, and for about 6 to 8 months, something like that, I just made music and traveled. I did nothing else. And I had no idea what I was going to do with my life. I had no idea what was going to happen. I went to India for a long time. I went to China. I went to the Middle East. I went to Thailand. I was doing some charity work, things like that. And then I was also working on my own music, but just not sure what I wanted to do. There were some opportunities to be a touring guitarist in bands. So I was weighing all these things. I get back to LA, and I had heard that they were reforming Capitol Music Group under Universal. So Capitol was previously part of a different company, EMI, and that Universal had acquired it. And that Steve Barnett was running Capitol. And Steve Barnett was an executive. He was at Epic, but before I worked at Epic. And then he was at Columbia, and Columbia and Epic were sort of sister labels. So I knew a lot of the people at Columbia. I did not know Steve himself, but I knew people that knew him and knew people that were going to work at Capitol. Because generally when a senior executive shifts from one company to another, there's usually an ecosystem that follows them in some way of people that they know and trust that have worked with them, right?
Yep.
And so I was interested in seeing what was going on at Capitol, and I started talking to a few people that were working within the label group. And Capitol, and this will play out when I talk about what my current job is, Capitol is not just one label. It's Capitol Music Group. It's not just Capitol Records. So there's other labels within Capitol Music Group. There's Blue Note, which is a jazz label, Astralworks, which is a dance label. There's Harvest, which is a historic label that was resurrected at that time. That's like the label Pink Floyd originally signed to, was Harvest. Their mission was kind of to really focus on sort of like out of the box indie music that's sort of like a misfit toy in kind of like a beautiful way. And I actually was originally talking to people that worked within Capitol Music Group about working for Harvest. I was not going to work for Capitol Records. And I thought I was going to do something a little bit more closer to like A&R or production or on the music creation side. Didn't end up working out for a host of reasons, but I got introduced to some of the people at Capitol Records, and they were looking for somebody who had marketing experience. And I wasn't really excited about it at the time, from what I remember, because I was like, oh, I've done this job. I don't know if I want to just get back into doing that again. But one of the things that was missing at Epic for me was like, I didn't get to work with too many artists that I was like purely a fan of. It was a lot of me having to intellectualize. And by the way, that's a very valuable part of the industry. You can't just work on music that you would be a fan of. You know, I ended up having a conversation with Michelle Jubilier, who's now our CEO. Didn't know her before this. And we just started talking and we like immediately clicked. And we sort of were speaking the same language. And she was like, look, we need somebody to be able to work with certain types of artists that we're going to be signing. They're not on the roster right now. And she was referring to Arcade Fire at the time. She was referring to Beck. She was referring to Paul McCartney. She was referring to specifically Note at the time, but artists like Troye Sivan, artists like Halsey, artists like Maggie Rogers. And you know, I immediately sort of picked up what she was putting out there in terms of the types of artists they wanted to focus on. And I was like, okay, I'm in. And I started as a marketing director at Capitol. So it was kind of a parallel move with where I was, or a lateral move, sorry, not parallel, lateral move with where I was at Epic. And I was thrown headfirst into working the Arcade Fire Reflector album campaign. This is in 2013. And it was just immediately, it was so exciting because it was like, I have resources. I'm working something that's like culturally in the now. That Montreal scene of Arcade Fire, Wolf Parade, Modest Mouse, those kinds of bands. I was like, this is music I'm a fan of. I'm so excited about this. It's incredible. And I felt like I just really came into my own at the company because there was leadership that sort of gave me the space to work on things I was passionate about, but also gave me autonomy. And one of the things I loved about Steve Barnett, who was running the company, is music CEOs, or major label CEOs, they come from all different types of backgrounds, but very few of them come from marketing backgrounds. A lot of them are A&R people or radio people or BA people because they're living in the acquisition business more than the development business. Steve was one who came from the development business. So he really supported marketing at the label, and marketing kind of became the center hub of everything at the label. I said I did more A&R as a marketer. The artists I work with at Capitol, like I would be in the studio with them, helping them figure out what songs go on things, giving them ideas, helping them with remixes, helping them with all sorts of things that A&R people traditionally do. And I was doing it in a way where I was like focused on the projects and the musical content more than it was about the acquisition part of it, which you're functioning more like a talent agent ultimately when you're trying to sign things or find things, right? It's less about developing the art. It's more about being at the show or being in the meeting or getting FaceTime. Those are all very valuable things. And there are people with far more social energy than I have who are much better at it than I am. But that was really my journey at Capitol. It started in marketing. And then I basically from 2013 to 2000, right before the pandemic, 2018, 19, I just kind of worked my way up through the ranks of marketing. So from a director to a senior director to a vice president. And it all just came with sort of growing levels of responsibility where I would be managing slightly more people. And that was really valuable for me too, because the progression for how you grow within a corporation is so valuable because I was never put in a position where I had more on my plate than I was ready for. And there are probably times where I wanted more on my plate, but the fact that it was a gradual growth at the company and internal, and I wasn't land grabbing for things, and I wasn't really motivated by titles or authority. I was more just like into the craft of learning it and networking with people and being with artists and enjoying what I was doing. I think it put me in a position that when I finally was like running a department or whatever, that I was in a better place for that. And by the time I started running marketing at the label, this was like right when the pandemic started, I had a history of building relationships with employees within the building and building relationships with the artists within the building. I felt like I was ready for that at that time. And then, with the next step at the beginning of this year, with now looking after much more than marketing and looking after the entire company, a lot of it still applies, where I feel like I was able to graduate up the steps versus having to land grab.
Yeah. Super, super interesting. I mean, what's so clear to me is obviously, one, your passion, but two, the fact that in some instances, almost accidentally, you've been able to develop this very versatile skill set between talent acquisition, development, marketing. You've seen all these various facets of the industry. Can you speak a little bit to how your role has shape-shifted a bit since you've become president? What skill sets you're tapping into on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, I think in this position, which is unique to this position, you have to be okay with focusing on a macro level. And that sounds easy. Oh, I get to see the top of the company and the senior leadership at the company. But you have to give people autonomy in their roles because
you can't go into the weeds.
Yeah. And sometimes you need to go into the weeds, but you have to strike a balance. And I think that's probably the thing that is the, not culture shock, but I think it's the skill that needs to be developed, because pair that with everything we're taught as first generation. Pair that with you have to be the engineer of your own success. What's in your hands is what you control. You have to ring fence it. You have to own it. And now apply that to a situation where you're running an organization and you have to trust people and you have to allow them latitude to fail or succeed and own those failures and successes.
Absolutely. And
balance that with competing agendas. This is kind of like the thing I'm learning right now, which is running a marketing team of 15, 20 some odd people is very different from running a company that's 250 plus people. But again, there's things you learn from each step of the way that I think help prepare you for that. And I think we are a company that's undergone a lot of change. We've had multiple changes in leadership through the pandemic. We're an industry now that's coming, I'm going to say out of the pandemic, even though we're living in this like weird world of pseudo-pandemic or whatever we call it now. And the marketplace for music has completely changed in the last year in terms of what genres are succeeding, what types of artists are succeeding, consumer behaviors, all that stuff. So there's a lot of readjustment and recalibration that's happening right now. And I don't think that's just at Capital or my role. I think that's industry-wide. So I think it's balancing that while trying to provide the stability and leadership that an organization of this size needs. I think that's where a lot of my focus is on a day-to-day basis, but also not losing touch with the art or the artists. And that becomes less and less convenient the higher up you get into a corporation. But I've sort of resolved to myself to like never get too far from that, because without that, none of this exists. So
yeah, makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, looking back on your career thus far, can you speak to any of those specific projects and artists that you've had the opportunity to work with that have been particularly memorable?
Yeah, there's plenty of them. You know, I mentioned Arcade Fire, Paul McCartney. Obviously, it's just like an insane thing. A, to work with somebody of that stature, but B, for them to live up to that stature when you develop a relationship with them. He's everything you would want him to be in terms of like, you know, I talked about the balance of vision versus collaboration. He embodies that. He's so democratic about the way he works, but when he's locked in on something, you have to respect the vision. One of the most like pinch me moments of my career was if you watch the Paul McCartney carpool karaoke that he did with James Corden. it was done in Liverpool, and it was kind of driving to all of these iconic locations within Liverpool, like Penny Lane and like his house where he grew up. It's more than a carpool karaoke. It's a kind of like a mini doc in a way. And I flew to Liverpool for that. And I was like in a car behind him, like following him to all these places. And then it ended with them playing like a surprise show at a pub there. It was just like one of those insane things. And I was so jet lagged that it felt like I was on like psychedelics or something. So it was just, that was incredible.
I love that.
Beck is an artist that I've had some of the most rewarding experiences of my career working with, him and his team. The album that we did, Morning Phase, which won Album of the Year at the Grammys, which was like a total like dark horse surprise, was just like incredible. And that campaign was one of like, there wasn't a lot of commercial ambition around that album when it came out. But I remember that I was given a demo CD of like the unmixed recordings when we first signed Beck. And they were like, oh, he's made this sort of mellower album. And I remember I got into my car. I was going hiking and I drove from my place in Hollywood to Topanga Canyon, which is like a 30, 40-minute drive. And I put on this CD and I just listened to it front to back. And I remember I parked my car and I told the person I was with at the time, that's going to win Album of the Year. That is one of the most incredible things I've ever heard.
Wow.
And I was so resolute about it. That campaign took like a year and a half of just like working and slogging and making sure that we were doing everything we can to promote it. And it all sort of paid off. And this belief in this record that was like this sort of like raft that just somehow found a way to the sea or whatever was just like incredible. Working with Troye Sivan has been one of the best things that I've been able to do, because I just remember at the time when I first met him, he was 17 years old, something like that. And he didn't even have a manager. Wow. And he just got off a plane from Australia and he came to the Capitol Tower, and an A&R guy that was working at the building at the time was like, hey, you should meet him. And I didn't know much about him. And I did a little Googling around about him. And I'm like, this guy's a YouTuber. Like, what? Like, this isn't legit. I don't want to. And I met him and he was so impressive. I mean, he just talked to me about his artistic vision. He played me demos. He showed me lyrics. He showed me mood boards. And it was all stuff that he was just sitting in his bedroom doing these things. And I was just like, what an inspiring human being. And to then be able to help and work with an artist who's been such like an important cultural touchstone for so many marginalized people has been incredibly rewarding. You know, some of the work that we've done with Halsey, when I was able to help pair her and Trent Reznor, the Nine Inch Nails guys, together to make this last album, that was a really rewarding experience. But yeah, I mean, those are just some of the few. There's so many. Yeah. But what I will say is, in this current role, that's another part of the shift. My wins and losses are more than any one given project or one given campaign.
Yeah.
It's about the successes of the company, the employees at the company, the culture of the company. And yes, the artists and the projects are the engine that drives that ultimately. But I get as much gratification now seeing someone come in at a junior level of the organization and get promoted up to a senior level because we help their career path and give them the leadership and guidance that helps them evolve as an executive. That's just as rewarding to me now.
Wow. It's so fascinating. There's obviously so much range, clearly, in what you've accomplished, even the artists that you work with. And now, as you said, it spans, you know, an even bigger pool of people that you feel responsible for. As you think about your career and how far you've come to date, what advice do you have for young South Asians who are not only passionate about potentially making a career in the business of music, but as musicians themselves potentially?
I would say that, and I'm tailoring this advice to South Asians in particular, educate yourself. Don't shut off to any information. There's so much to the world of artistry, of music, of entertainment. There's so many different ways to subsist in that world and to thrive in that world. Don't limit yourself to one avenue. That was, I think, a big part of my personal development. Simultaneously, don't be afraid to follow your instincts. I know that there's a lot of pressures that come with whether it's a South Asian background or first generation or the immigrant experience and then the offshoot of the immigrant experience in this country that requires you to think short term you don't have to be confined to that. You don't. And I don't say that lightly because it's not easy. When there's matters of dollars and cents at hand and there's pressures for immediate upward mobility, things like that.
Yeah.
Success is a long arc. And, it's interesting. There are some Indians that I've become friends with and close with that are more in the VC space or the tech space. And they've made comments to me too, like, oh, I was on the ground floor of a startup or something like that. And people who weren't of my descent that were at that company were less risk averse than I was. And because of that, we actually lost a lot of money because I felt like I needed to feed into that. And I felt like I needed to yield my perspective.
Interesting.
I think you can follow your own compass when it comes to these things. And don't be afraid to take risks. I know these things can sound like platitudes, but they're hard to embody at your core when you're built a certain way.
Yeah.
And I would also say that value work-life balance. I know that there's an instinct to work until you drop and I have to be working all the time. But that comes with sacrifice, and that sacrifice is your ambition and your perspective and your ability to dream sometimes and see past the confines of whatever your situation is. I would just say that also there's no monoculture anymore. There's no one way to do something and be a successful artist. If you want to go and make songs in Tamil that are country and rap, you can. If you want to mix, I don't know, Bollywood and grime, you can. There's no rules now. When I was learning music and thinking about how I would want to have a career in music, there were very defined lanes. You can embrace the chaos and use it to your advantage.
Yeah.
The last thing I was going to say is also embrace self-starting. Don't think that there's going to be some institution that comes in and props you up or indemnifies you from having to constantly self-start. I think that there's a culture of anointment, I think that happens where it's like, oh, I need someone to tell me that this is okay, or I need someone to tell me that there's an institution backing me. You can start your SoundCloud account and go. Like, you can do your own thing. So yeah, those are some things that come to mind.
Thank you for sharing that. Something that I feel like has been an underlying motif through this conversation is the transformation of the industry over the past at least 15 years since you started. Can you speak to what you think are going to be the 3 biggest trends that shape and define this industry for the coming decade or so?
Some of it touches back on what I was saying when we were talking about artistry and what makes something essential. I think having a dialogue with an audience and a subculture is going to be the most crucial thing. You cannot be everything to everyone right away now. You have to take a journey to get to that place. And that journey is not going to continue unless you have an authentic dialogue with a very tapped in audience. I think the days of the constructed global pop star, I don't know if that exists in the same way going forward. I would say that we live in this world of disruption, new technologies, new avenues to reach people. That can be really disorienting. There becomes this arms race to how can I hack culture, or how can I get to an audience in a different way using a technology. Those are all very exciting things. And I do think we're going to have to be on the cutting edge of it. But I think in a way, there's going to be sort of a moment where the focus comes back to artistry over anything else. Because I think there's going to be a saturation of people who are finding ways to hack culture. And then suddenly there's going to be hey, we need real artists. We forgot about that. Yeah. That's something that I hope is a defining element of what's to come in the industry. And I would just say that the way that music functions in culture is going to be a rapidly evolving thing. Music as a tune-in destination, music as wallpaper, music as social content. These things are all happening in equal measure right now. Yeah. And I think that you're going to see artists who can build careers in different ways. And it's not going to follow the model of what we think of or what we thought of, which is you sell millions of albums and you have a bunch of hits on the radio and you play sold out shows. Like, there's going to be many ways to have a really successful career as an artist or a creator. that we should all embrace.
Yeah. Super, super exciting to hear. The last question I have for you is, as you think about being in this senior role at the Capitol Music Group, where do you envision taking this industry? How do you want to change it?
There's a lot of things that I sort of aspirationally think about that I want to grow over time. And again, none of this happens right away. I really do take seriously that I want Capitol to be like a haven for artistry and artists that have a perspective that maybe goes against the current of whatever's popular at the time. I think there's a lot of people who are trying to just grab momentum. I would like for Capitol to be a place where we can be confident and stick to artists that have a unique perspective and make sure that there's always a place for those artists. Beyond the types of artists that I want us to be home to and foster, a big part of what I would like to accomplish moving forward is building a diverse corporate culture. And that sounds like something that people say a lot, but I don't think that it's accomplished in the way that lends itself to sustainability. And by that, I mean, it's not about just hiring people at senior levels or making representational hires that you write a press release about. That's, of course, important. There should be diverse voices at senior levels. I'm a living embodiment of that. But it's about creating support for career growth at junior levels for diverse employees and candidates.
Absolutely.
There's a lot that I've witnessed in my time working at major labels where diversity of thought is not necessarily supported. And I have definitely resolved that I'm going to go out of my way to try and accommodate diversity of thought and support diversity of thought. I would also say that the entry point to getting into a corporation and diversifying what that entry point is really important to me. Entry-level salaries and living as an entry-level employee, especially in major cities, it's a tough existence. And it lends itself to people that have either income safety nets or generational wealth or, some level of security, being able to take those jobs and being able to subsist in a major city with those jobs. And I think it's really important that we figure out a way where we're getting to communities and getting to potential employees and offering them a path to upward career mobility that breaks through that.
Yeah. And
I would also say that the touch points for where somebody can discover a career in the music industry, diversifying that is very important. I mean, I'm, again, a living embodiment of that. When I was in high school and talking to my parents about where I should go to college, they wanted me to go to medical school. They wanted me to go to not the school that I ended up going to. And the fact that I made that decision, I probably would not be working where I am now if I had not made that decision at that time. So, whether that's broadening the universities or the schools that we do outreach to, that's all part of it. So that's all to say that diversifying corporate culture, it's a very complicated thing, but it's also not just about top down, it's about bottom up.
Absolutely. Well, I think it's a very powerful way of paying your own experiences forward. And obviously something that, to your point, a lot of leaders are able to do lip service to, but it seems like you've clearly thought so deeply about this and it comes from a very personal place. So thank you for sharing that. Thank you for taking the time to share your story. I just know it has the power to truly uplift so many young South Asians who are curious about this industry and want to pursue it. So thank you again for taking the time to share it, Arjun.
Thank you so much. It was great talking to you.
Thanks for joining us for today's episode. If you want to get new episodes straight to your inbox, subscribe to our newsletter at southasiantrailblazers.com and follow us at South Asian Trailblazers on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn.